The war had lasted 18 cycles, and nobody remembered how to live without it anymore. Dr. Elena Vasquez stood at the observation window of the medical frigate Mercy's Hope and watched the stars drift past like cold, distant diamonds scattered across black velvet. And she wondered if her daughter would have loved this view the way she once loved watching fireflies in their backyard on Earth. But her daughter was gone now, taken by a sickness that no medicine could cure, and Elena had joined the coalition fleet because staying on Earth meant drowning in memories she could not escape. The Velthari were the enemy of every species in the known galaxy, and the reports about them filled datapads across every coalition ship with horror stories that kept soldiers awake at night. They were reptilian creatures standing nearly 3 meters tall with scales harder than battle armor and claws that could tear through steel plating like paper. And their eyes glowed with a predatory intelligence that made even the bravest warriors tremble. Nobody survived an encounter with them, and everybody knew this simple truth, like they knew their own names. Elena was a xenobiologist, which meant she studied alien life forms and tried to understand how different species lived and breathed and thought. And the Mercy's Hope was supposed to stay far from combat zones because medical ships carried no heavy weapons, but the Velthari did not care about rules or trees or the markings that declared a vessel. Non-combatant attack came without warning. On what should have been a quiet night, Cyclella was in her quarters, reviewing research files when the first explosion rocked the ship and threw her against the wall so hard that stars burst behind her eyes, and alarms began screaming through every corridor like wounded animals, crying for help that would never come. She grabbed her emergency pack because training had drilled this response into her bones, and she ran through hallways filled with smoke and fire and the screams of crew members she had eaten breakfast with just hours before. The ship was dying around her, and she could feel it in the way the floor tilted and the lights flickered like candles in a storm. And she knew with terrible certainty that the Mercy's Hope would not survive this night. Escape pods were launching in every direction, but most of them were being picked off by Velthari fighters that swarmed around the frigate like hungry sharks around bleeding prey. And Elena watched through a viewport as one pod after another exploded into brief flowers of flame that died instantly in the vacuum of space. She found a damaged shuttle in the lower bay, and the pilot was already dead at the controls, with blood pooling beneath his chair. And Elena did not let herself think about his face or his name as she pushed his body aside and took his place. Shuttle launched just as the Mercy's Hope broke apart behind her in a silent, catastrophic bloom of fire and debris, and Elena pushed the engines harder than they were designed to go because Velthari fighters were already turning toward her. She did not know how long she flew or how many times she nearly died as plasma bolts streaked past her viewport close enough to feel their heat. But somehow she found an uncharted moon, and somehow she managed to crash land on its frozen surface without killing herself in the process. The impact was brutal, and everything went dark when Elena woke up. The shuttle was half buried in snow and ice, and her left arm was broken, and her head was bleeding, and every breath felt like swallowing broken glass. But she was alive, and she could not decide if that was a blessing or a curse. The moon was a frozen wasteland of white and gray and pale blue ice that stretched in every direction as far as she could see, and the temperature outside was cold enough to kill her within minutes if she did not find shelter. She wrapped herself in emergency thermal blankets and grabbed her medkit and her pack and started walking, because staying in the shuttle meant waiting to freeze or waiting for the Velthari to find her, and neither option seemed acceptable. The wind cut through her like knives made of ice, and every step was agony. But Elena kept moving, because that was what she had always done when the world fell apart around her. She had kept moving when her husband left, and she had kept moving when her daughter died, and she would keep moving now, even if every cell in her body screamed for her to lie down and surrender to the cold hours past, or maybe days, because time became meaningless in the endless white. And Elena was beginning to accept that she would die on this frozen rock far from home, when she saw the dark mouth of a cave system opening in the ice. Ahead of her, like a promise of shelter, she stumbled inside, and the relief from the wind was immediate and profound. And she collapsed against the cave wall and let herself breathe for what felt like the first time since the attack. The cave went deeper than she expected, and she followed it because deeper meant warmer and warmer meant survival. And she used her emergency light to guide her through passages that twisted and turned like the inside of some great frozen beast. That was when she heard the sounds. They were high-pitched and desperate, and they made her translator device crackle with static as it tried and failed to interpret them. And Elena followed the sounds because curiosity had always been stronger than fear in her heart. What she found made her stop so suddenly that she nearly fell in a nest made of thermal moss and strange crystalline fibers. There were 3 small creatures, huddled together and shaking with cold and fear. And Elena recognized them immediately from the intelligence briefing she had studied on the ship. They were Valkyrie cubs. The smallest of them could not have been more than a few months old, and its leg was bent at an angle that spoke of injury and pain. And all 3 of them had scales that were dull, and eyes that were clouded, and bodies that trembled with starvation. Every report Elena had ever read said that Valkyrie young were just as dangerous as adults, and that they were born with the instinct to kill. And every survival training she had received told her to leave immediately and find another shelter, because these creatures would grow up to slaughter her kind without mercy. But Elena did not see monsters when she looked at them. She saw children. She saw small, scared, hungry children who had been abandoned in the cold and who were crying for help that was not coming. And something inside her chest cracked open like ice breaking in spring. She thought of her daughter, and the way she used to cry when she was scared, and the way Elena would hold her and sing to her until the fear went away. And she thought about how her daughter had died alone in a hospital bed because Elena had been at a conference and had not made it back in time. She had not been there for her own child, but she was here now. Elena set down her pack and pulled out her emergency rations and her medkit, and she approached the nest slowly with her hands raised to show she meant no harm. And the cubs hissed at her with tiny fangs bared, but they were too weak to do anything more than make sounds. She sat down at the edge of the nest, and she opened a ration bar and held it out toward them. And she weighted the smallest one with the injured leg, looked at her with eyes that held more fear than aggression. And Elena felt tears freeze on her cheeks as she smiled at it. "It is okay," she whispered in a voice that cracked from cold and emotion. "I am not going to hurt you." She stayed. The first day was the hardest because the cubs did not trust her, and Elena did not know if she was making a terrible mistake. She kept her distance at first and simply left food near the nest and retreated to watch from the shadows. And the cubs would hiss and snap their tiny jaws whenever she moved too quickly or came too close, but hunger was a force stronger than fear, and eventually the largest of the 3 crept forward on shaking legs and sniffed at the ration bar she had left. And after a long moment of hesitation, it grabbed the food and retreated back to the nest, where all 3 cubs devoured it in seconds. Elena rationed her supplies carefully because she did not know how long she would be stranded on this frozen moon. But she found herself giving more to the cubs than she kept for herself because they were small and starving, and she could not bear to watch them suffer. The days blended together in a rhythm of survival and slow trust building that felt like the most important work Elena had ever done. She learned their names through a combination of sounds and gestures and patient repetition that took longer than she expected, and her translator slowly adapted to their frequency until she could understand the basic meanings. Behind their chirps and growls, the largest one was called Keth, and he was the bravest of the three. Always the first to approach her and the first to accept food from her hand when the others were still too scared to come close. The middle one was Vera, and she was cautious and watchful, and her golden eyes followed Elena everywhere she went, like she was trying to solve a puzzle that did not make sense. And Elena often caught her tilting her head in confusion when Elena did something unexpected, like smile or laugh. The smallest was San, and his injured leg needed treatment that Elena was not sure she could provide. But she tried anyway, because trying was better than doing nothing. She splinted the leg with materials from her medkit and wrapped it in bandages that were meant for human wounds, but seemed to work well enough for Valtteri scales. And San screamed and thrashed during the process until his siblings held him down with their small bodies. When it was over, San looked at Elena with eyes that were wet with tears she did not know Valtteri could produce. And he made a sound that her translator interpreted as something between gratitude and confusion. That night was the first time one of them touched her willingly. Elena was shivering against the cave wall because the temperature had dropped even lower than usual, and her thermal blankets were not enough to keep the cold from seeping into her bones. And she had accepted that she might not survive until morning, but then she felt warmth press against her side, and she opened her eyes to find Keth curled up next to her with his scales radiating heat like a living furnace. And within minutes, Vera joined him on her other side while San crawled into her lap and tucked his head under her chin. They slept like that, and Elena survived the night after that. Everything changed. The cubs began to follow her whenever she moved through the cave system, and they would chirp and trill in ways that sounded almost like conversation. And Elena talked to them constantly because the sound of her own voice kept her sane in this frozen isolation. She told them about Earth and the blue oceans and green forests and the way sunlight felt on a human skin. And she told them about her daughter and the songs she used to sing and the way her laugh could fill a room with warmth. The cubs did not understand her words, but they seemed to understand her tone, and they would grow quiet and still whenever she spoke about her daughter, like they could sense the grief that lived in every syllable. Elena began singing to them because music was a language that needed no translation. She sang lullabies her mother had sung to her and songs she had sung to her daughter and melodies she made up on the spot because the silence of the cave was too heavy to bear. And the cubs would close their eyes and sway, and sometimes they would try to sing along in their own alien way. San was the first to purr. It happened on the seventh day when Elena was changing his bandages and checking the progress of his healing leg. And the sound that came from his chest was so unexpected that she froze in place and stared at him with wide eyes. No human had ever heard Valtteri purr because no human had ever gotten close enough to one without dying. And here was this tiny creature making a sound of pure contentment while a member of the enemy species tended to his wounds. Elena recorded everything on her damaged datapad because she was still a scientist even in these impossible circumstances. But she was not recording for military intelligence or strategic advantage. She was recording because she wanted someone somewhere to understand what she was learning. The Valtteri were not mindless monsters driven only by hunger and violence, and their young were not born killers incapable of connection or trust. They were people alien and strange and different in ways that humans had never tried to understand, but people nonetheless with feelings and fears and the capacity for bonds to cross the boundaries of species. Keth brought her a gift on the 10th day. He had gone exploring in the deeper parts of the cave and returned with a crystal formation clutched carefully in his claws. And he presented it to Elena with a ceremony that felt almost reverent. Her translator struggled with his words, but the meaning came through clearly enough. For Pack, he said. For mother who is not mother, but is. Elena cried for a long time after that, and the cubs pressed close to her and made worried sounds because they did not understand human tears. And she had to show them that sometimes humans cried when they were happy, and not just when they were sad. Vera started bringing her gifts too, and then San joined in despite his injured leg. And soon Elena had a small collection of crystals and interesting rocks and strange frozen plants that the cubs had gathered. From around the cave, she arranged them carefully in a corner of their sleeping area, and the cubs would look at the collection with pride like they had built something important. Together, the food ran out on the 12th day. Elena had stretched her rations as far as they could go, but emergency supplies were not meant to feed 4 beings for nearly 2 weeks. And she faced the reality that they would all starve if help did not come soon. But the cubs were hunters, even at their young age, and they knew this moon in ways Elena never could. Keth led her to a frozen underground lake where strange eyeless fish swam beneath the ice. And Vera showed her which cave plants were safe to eat and which ones were poison. And together they survived in ways that should not have been possible. Elena taught them in return. She showed them how to make fire with the emergency supplies in her kit, and the cubs stared at the flames with wonder and terror until they understood that fire was a tool and not a threat. And she taught them human words and human songs and human games that made them chirp with laughter. They were a pack now, bonded by survival and something deeper that Elena could not name. When the Vulturi hunting party finally tracked her emergency beacon to the cave on the 15th day, they expected to find a human corpse and 3 starved cubs, barely clinging to life. What they found would shake the foundations of everything they believed about humanity. What they found was a family. War Commander Thalric had served the Velthri Empire for 40 cycles, and he had seen things that would break lesser warriors into pieces. He had led the assault on the Corvani homeworld and watched their cities burn. And he had commanded the fleet that shattered the Mandari defense line and ended their species forever. And he had personally killed more enemies than he could count with claws and blade and plasma fire, but nothing in his long and bloody career had prepared him for what he found. In that frozen cave, the cubs had been missing for 16 days, and the Broodmother Ascendant had nearly torn the fleet apart searching for them. Because these were not ordinary young ones, but the children of the Supreme Leader herself. Thalric had volunteered to lead the recovery personally, because finding the Broodmother's offspring would bring glory to his bloodline for generations. And he had assembled his best hunters and tracked the faint emergency signal to this forgotten moon at the edge of known space. His soldiers breached the cave with weapons raised and thermal scopes painting the darkness in shades of heat and cold, and they moved with the silent precision of predators who had hunted prey across 1,000 worlds. The human appeared in their scopes first. She was small and fragile and wrapped in the tattered remains of a coalition uniform that marked her as enemy. And Thalric felt his scales ripple with anticipation, because humans were rare prey and valuable trophies. But then he saw how she was sitting. Cubs were tangled around her in a sleeping pile of scales and soft human skin, and their small bodies rose and fell with the rhythm of peaceful slumber. And the human's arms were wrapped around them in a gesture that looked almost protective. Alarkrek raised his plasma lance and aimed it directly at the human skull. "Step away from them. Pray," he growled in a voice that had made countless enemies beg for mercy. The human looked up at him, and he saw exhaustion in her face and malnutrition in the hollows of her cheeks and injuries that should have killed her days ago. But he also saw something else that he could not immediately name. She did not run, she did not scream or cry or beg the way humans usually did when facing death. And she did not try to use the cubs as hostages or bargaining chips, the way a strategic enemy might instead. She tightened her grip on the cubs and shifted her body so that she was between them and his weapon. And she looked directly into his eyes with a defiance that made his scales itch with confusion. "No," she said in a voice that was barely more than a whisper. Thorek felt his claw hesitate on the trigger, and he did not understand why. "They are very young," he snarled. "You are human prey, and you have no right to touch them. So step away now, or I will burn you where you sit." The cubs were waking now, and Thorek watched as Keth lifted his head and blinked at the soldiers surrounding them. And the young one's first reaction was not to run toward his own kind, but to press closer to the human and bare his small fangs at the hunters. "Get away from her," Keth chirped in the voice of a cub trying to sound fierce. "She is Pack, and you will not hurt her." Thorek stared at the scene before him, and his mind refused to process what his eyes were showing him. Vira was awake now, too, and she had positioned herself at the human side with her claws extended. And little San, with his bandaged leg, was trying to climb in front of the human like his tiny body could somehow shield her from plasma fire. The Rutmother's own offspring were protecting the enemy from their own people. "What madness is this?" one of Thorek's soldiers muttered, and the confusion in his voice matched the confusion that was spreading through the entire hunting party. The human spoke again, and her voice was steady despite the weapons aimed at her heart. "I am not going to let you hurt them," she said. And Thorek realized with a shock that she thought they had come to harm the cubs. "We are here to rescue them." Thorek growled. "We are their people, and we have been searching for them for 16 days while you have been doing who knows what to them." "I have been keeping them alive," the human said. Simply. Thorek studied her more closely, and he saw the empty food containers scattered around the cave and the medical supplies that had been used to treat San's injured leg, and the small collection of crystals and plants that looked like gifts arranged with care. He saw a nest that had been built for 4 and not for 1. "She fed us when we were starving," Kath said, and his young voice cracked with emotion. "She gave us her food even when she had nothing left for herself. And she kept us warm when the cold was trying to kill us. And she sang to us when we were scared. She fixed my leg," San added. And he crawled fully into the human's lap and wrapped his small arms around her neck. "She is our mother now, and you cannot take her away from us." Thorek felt something shift in his chest that he had never experienced before. He had killed humans by the thousands, and he had never once considered them to be anything more than weak and pathetic creatures fit only for conquest. And he had certainly never imagined that one of them could protect Velthari young with more devotion than many Velthari parents showed. "Why?" he asked. And the question came out before he could stop it. The human looked at him, and there was no fear in her eyes anymore. "Why what?" she asked. "Why did you help them?" Thorek demanded. "You are human and we are Velthari, and our species have been killing each other for 18 cycles. So why would you sacrifice yourself for enemy young when you could have left them to die and saved your own rations for yourself?" The human smiled, and it was a strange expression that Thorek had never seen on human prey before, because usually they only screamed and cried. "They were alone," she said in a voice that was soft but somehow filled the entire cave. "They were hungry and scared and hurt, and they were children. And I could not walk away from children who needed help. But they are Velthari," Thorek pressed. "They will grow up to be warriors who kill your kind." "Maybe," the human agreed. "Or maybe they will grow up to remember that a human helped them when no one else did. And maybe that will change something." She stroked San's head gently, and the cub made that purring sound that Thorek had never heard before. "I do not protect children because of what they might become," she said. I protect them because that is what you do when you find someone small and scared who needs help. Thoric looked at his soldiers and saw the same confusion on their faces that he felt in his own heart. He looked at the cubs who were still positioned around the human like she was the most precious thing in the universe, and very slowly he lowered his weapon. What is your name, human? He asked. Elena, she said. Elena Vasquez. Elena Vasquez, Thoric repeated. And the human name felt strange on his tongue. The Blood Mother Ascendant will want to meet you. For the first time, Elena showed fear. Are you going to kill me? She asked. Thoric looked at the cubs who were watching him with desperate hope in their young eyes. I do not know, he admitted. But you saved the Blood Mother's children, and that is not something that can be ignored. So you will come with us and she will decide your fate. Elena nodded and she began to stand, but the cubs would not release her. We go where she goes, Keth said firmly. And his siblings nodded in agreement. Thoric had no idea how to explain any of this to the Blood Mother, but he knew that something had changed, and he suspected that nothing would ever be the same again. The journey to the Valkyrie flagship took 3 days, and Elena spent most of that time in a small holding cell that was more comfortable than the frozen cave but infinitely more terrifying. She was a prisoner of the most feared species in the galaxy, and every rational part of her mind screamed that she would never see another sunrise. But the cubs refused to leave her side, and that small comfort kept her from surrendering to despair. Keth slept against the cell door like a tiny guard and growled at any soldier who came too close. And Vera spent hours teaching Elena more Valkyrie words with a patience that reminded Elena of her own daughter learning to read. And Sans simply stayed in her lap and purred whenever she stroked his scales. The soldiers watched them with expressions that ranged from confusion to disgust to something that almost looked like wonder. They have never seen anything like this, Vera explained when Elena asked why everyone stared at them. Valkyrie do not bond with prey species, and our people believe that humans are incapable of kindness. Is that what they teach you? Elena asked. They teach us that humans are weak and selfish, and that you only care about your own survival. Keth answered from his position by the door. They say you would sacrifice your own young to save yourselves if you had to. Elena thought about all the parents she knew back on Earth, and all the mothers and fathers who would die without hesitation to protect their children. That is not true, she said softly. Humans love their children more than anything in the universe. I know that now, Keth said. And he looked at her with eyes that held more understanding than any child should possess. You showed us. The flagship was massive beyond anything Elena had imagined. A city-sized vessel that bristled with weapons capable of destroying entire worlds. And the sheer scale of Valkyrie power made her feel smaller than she had ever felt before. She was escorted through corridors filled with warriors who stopped and stared as the strange procession passed by. And whispers followed them like shadows because word had spread throughout the fleet about the human who had saved the Blood Mother's cubs. Some of the whispers were hostile, and Elena heard words that her translator interpreted as prey and food and abomination. But others were different, and she caught fragments that sounded almost like curiosity and even respect. The cubs walked beside her with their heads held high like they were daring anyone to challenge their chosen pack member. And more than one warrior stepped back when Keth bared his small fangs at them. They reached the throne room, and Elena's breath caught in her chest. At the sight before her, the Blood Mother Ascendant was the largest Valkyrie Elena had ever seen. Easily 5 meters tall, with scales that gleamed like polished obsidian and eyes that burned with an intelligence that seemed to see straight through to Elena's soul. She sat upon a throne made from the bones of conquered species, and a sight made Elena's stomach turn with horror. But she forced herself to stand straight and meet the ancient creature's gaze without flinching. So, the Broodmother's voice shook the chamber like thunder rolling across mountains. This is the human who kept my bloodline alive. Elena opened her mouth to respond, but the cubs moved before she could speak. All three of them ran toward their mother with cries of joy, and the Broodmother descended from her throne to receive them with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a creature so massive and terrifying. She examined each of them carefully, and Elena watched as those burning eyes lingered on San's bandaged leg and the healthy gleam that had returned to their scales and the weight they had regained from food they should not have had. You were starving when you disappeared, the Broodmother said to her cubs. Now you are healthy and strong, so tell me how this happened. Elena saved us, San said simply, and he pointed at the human with his small claw. She found us in the cave, and she gave us her food, and she fixed my leg, and she kept us warm, and she sang to us when we were scared. She is Pack, Keth added firmly. She is mother who is not mother, but is. The Broodmother rose to her full height and turned her attention back to Elena, and the weight of that gaze was almost enough to drive Elena to her knees. My hunters tell me that when they found you, you shielded my offspring with your own body, the Broodmother said. They tell me that you positioned yourself between their weapons and my cubs, as if you intended to take the killing blow yourself. I did, Elena confirmed, and her voice shook but did not break. Why? The Broodmother asked. And it was the same question Thorek had asked in the cave. Elena took a deep breath and searched for words that could explain something that felt as natural as breathing. Where I come from, she began slowly. We believe that children are sacred, and it does not matter whose children they are or what species they belong to, because a child in danger deserves protection from anyone who is able to give it. Even enemy children, the Broodmother pressed. There is no such thing as enemy children, Elena said, and she felt tears building behind her eyes as she spoke. They are just children, and they deserve to be safe and fed and loved, regardless of what their parents have done or what they might do when they grow up. The Broodmother studied her in silence for a long moment. I have conquered 700 worlds, she said finally. I have ended species and burned civilizations to ash, and I have ruled my people through strength and fear for longer than your species has traveled among the stars. Elena waited because there was nothing she could say to that. In all that time, the Broodmother continued, no enemy has ever shown mercy to Velthari Young, and we have shown no mercy in return because that is the way of the universe as we understand it. She descended from the platform until she stood directly in front of Elena, so close that Elena could feel the heat radiating from her massive body. You had every reason to hate my children, the Broodmother said. Your ship was destroyed by our forces, and your crew was killed, and you were stranded alone on a frozen moon. And yet, when you found 3 helpless cubs of the enemy species, you chose to sacrifice your own survival for theirs. I did not think of them as enemies, Elena whispered. That is what confuses me, the Broodmother admitted. And Elena heard something in her voice that sounded almost like vulnerability. We have studied your species, and we believe we understood you. But nothing in our intelligence suggested that humans were capable of this kind of selfless compassion. Maybe you were studying the wrong things. Elena said. The Broodmother made a sound that might have been a laugh. Perhaps we were, she agreed. So tell me, Elena Vasquez of the human species, what do you want in return for saving my children? Elena blinked in surprise because she had expected death, not negotiation. I did not do it for a reward, she said. Everything has a price, the Broodmother insisted. Name yours. Elena looked at the cubs who had gathered around her legs again, like she was a tree they wanted to climb. And she looked at the Broodmother, who ruled an empire built on conquest and blood. And she thought about what she truly wanted. I want you to consider the possibility that we do not have to be enemies forever. Elena said, I want you to think about what it might mean that a human could love your children as if they were her own. The Brother was silent for a very long time. You ask for something I cannot give, she said finally. The war has lasted too long, and too much blood has been spilled for peace to be possible. I am not asking for peace, Elena said. I am asking for a conversation. The throne room fell silent, and every Velthari present held their breath. And slowly, very slowly, the Broodmother Ascendant nodded her massive head. Very well, she said. We will talk. They talked for 7 days. Elena sat in a chamber that had once been used to interrogate prisoners, and she answered every question the Broodmother asked. And she asked questions of her own that no human had ever been allowed to ask, before she learned that the Velthari had not always been conquerors, that thousands of cycles ago they had been a peaceful species who lived on a beautiful world with 3 suns and oceans, the color of amber. But then the hunters had come. Hunters were a species that existed only in Velthari historical records now. A race of beings who had viewed the Velthari as nothing more than prey animals to be harvested and consumed. They had slaughtered billions, and they had taken special pleasure in hunting Velthari young, because the cubs were easier to catch, and their scales were considered delicacies. The Velthari had nearly gone extinct, but they had survived through rage and determination, and they had rebuilt their civilization around a single core principle that defined everything they became afterward. Never again would Velthari be prey. Never again would Velthari young be helpless. They had become the most fearsome predators in the galaxy, because fear was the only protection they understood. And they had conquered every species they encountered, because the only way to guarantee safety was to eliminate all potential threats. Elena listened to this history with tears streaming down her face, because she finally understood the Velthari were not monsters. They were survivors. They were a species shaped by trauma so profound that it had rewritten their entire culture. And every conquest and every act of violence was driven by a terror so deep that they could not see any other way to exist. We do what we must to protect our children, the Broodmother said, and there was ancient pain in her voice. You must understand this. I do understand it, Elena replied. Better than you might think. She told the Broodmother about Earth and the wars humans had fought among themselves for thousands of years. And she told her about the atrocities humans had committed against each other in the name of safety and survival. We are not so different, Elena said. We've done terrible things too when we were afraid. And how did you stop? The Broodmother asked. Your species is at peace with itself now, or so our intelligence suggests. Elena thought carefully about her answer. We did not stop completely, she admitted. We still struggle with fear and violence and hatred. But we learned something important along the way. What did you learn? That the cycle of violence only ends when someone chooses to break it, Elena said. That protecting children means protecting all children, including the children of people we fear. And that the only way to stop being afraid of the future is to build a better one instead of just destroying everything that might threaten us. The Broodmother was silent for a long time. You believe we could learn this too, she said finally. I believe you already have the capacity for it. Elena replied, I saw it in your cubs and the Broodmother. I see it in you when you look at them. She gestured at Kath and Vera and San, who were playing a game in the corner of the chamber. A game that Elena had taught them using rules she had made up to combine human and Velthari traditions. Your children learned to trust a human in 15 days, Elena continued. They learned to see me as family instead of food. And they are young, which means they learned what they were taught. You suggest that we have been teaching our young to hate when we could be teaching them something else. I am not suggesting anything, Elena said carefully. I am just telling you what I observed. The broodmother watched her cubs play, and Elena saw something shift in those ancient burning eyes. My mother was killed by the hunters when I was barely older than San, the broodmother said quietly. I remember hiding in a cave while they searched for survivors. And I remember the sounds of my siblings being dragged away as slaughter. Elena reached out and placed her small human hand on the broodmother's massive claw. It was the first time in history that a human had touched the supreme leader of the Velthari Empire in anything other than combat. I am sorry, Elena said simply. The broodmother looked at Elena's hand like she had never seen anything so strange. You touch me with compassion, she said. After everything my people have done to yours, you offer comfort instead of hatred. Hatred is exhausting, Elena said with a small smile. And it does not bring back the people we have lost. The broodmother made that sound again that might have been a laugh. You are a very strange creature, Elena Vasquez. So I have been told. The negotiations that followed were the most difficult and complex in the history of either species. Elena was officially designated as humanity's representative because the broodmother refused to speak with anyone else, and coalition diplomats were brought in to assist with the technical details while Elena handled the emotional work of building trust. There were setbacks and arguments and moments when it seemed like everything would collapse into renewed warfare. And there were voices on both sides who insisted that peace was impossible and that the enemy could never be trusted. But every time the talks threatened to break down, Elena would remind everyone of what had happened in that frozen cave. A starving human woman had given her food to enemy children. Velthari cubs had chosen to protect a human with their own small bodies, and somehow in the darkness and cold, new kind of family had been born. The treaty was signed 6 months after Elena was brought aboard the Velthari flagship, and it was not a perfect document because no treaty ever is, but it was a beginning trade. Routes were established and cultural exchange programs were created, and for the first time in 18 cycles, the killing stopped. Elena remained with the Velthari at the broodmother's request, serving as a permanent ambassador and advisor on human relations. She watched the cubs grow from frightened younglings into confident adolescents who carried themselves with the pride of their species while also carrying something new in their hearts. Geth became an advocate for peace, and he traveled to human worlds to speak about his experience with the human woman who had saved his life. And his words reached millions of beings on both sides of the former conflict. Vira studied xenobiology just like Elena, and she dedicated her life to understanding other species instead of fearing them. And her research would eventually lead to alliances with dozens of races who had once cowered before the Velthari Empire. Sen never quite lost his limp, but he never let it slow him down. And he became a teacher who spent his days with the youngest cubs, telling them stories about the universe and the strange creatures who lived in it. Always started with the same story. Once upon a time, there was a human woman who crashed on a frozen moon, and she found 3 hungry cubs in a cave. And instead of running away, she stayed. She stayed because that is what you do when you find children who need help. You stay. Years later, when Elena was old and gray, and her time was coming to an end, she sat in a garden aboard the same flagship where she had once been a prisoner. The garden had been built for her because Velthari had learned that humans needed green growing things to be happy. And it was filled with plants from 100 worlds, including roses from Earth that she tended with her own hands. Geth and Vera and San sat with her as they always did, and their own children played nearby with a mixture of Velthari cubs and human children from the embassy. Mother, San said softly, using the word he had called her since that first night in the cave. Are you afraid? Elena looked at the family she had found in the most unlikely place in the universe, and she smiled. No, little one, she said. I am grateful. She closed her eyes and listened to the sound of children laughing. Valkyrie and human voices mixing together in a melody that had never existed before she crashed on that frozen moon, and across the galaxy, a new word had entered the vocabulary of 100 species. Borrowed from the human tongue and spread by the Valkyrie themselves, Mathrit meant one who shields cubs not their own. It meant human, and it meant hope.